Well, it's finally time. We're to it. The F-4 Phantom. Well, Phantom 2 to be exact. Probably the single most famous jet aircraft of the Vietnam period and beyond. And not just for America, this was widely exported. Very successful. They produced just under 5,200 of these, which is a large number for a more or less modern jet aircraft. It would have even been a respectable number for a prop plane in World War I or World War II. Ooh, what a story. I mean, you could have a 2-hour documentary and not even really get it all. This thing saw decades of service. And the funniest part is, it was an accidental success. Really, this fighter was born out of boredom, or at least hunger. And in that sense, it's actually a triumph of capitalism, because a company was looking to the future, trying to think of new things to build so they could sell to the government to make some money. The F-4. This began as an internal project at the McDonald's Aircraft Company, Aircraft Corporation, St. Louis, Missouri, in the 1950s. At that time, early mid-50s, McDonald's did not have any potential new contracts on the horizon. The 101 Voodoo was well underway, and while it was still not ready for prime time, you have to kind of look to the future, because it takes years, even a decade or more, to get a military jet up and running. And so McDonald kind of looked around and considered, well, what maybe could be used? And they thought, well, the Navy could use a new jet. Air Force has been buying quite a few. They were in the middle of their Century series. And they thought, oh, maybe the Navy could use a new carrier fighter. So they started with the F-3 Demon and upgraded it, tinkered with it, showed it to the Air Force around 1954, and the Air Force liked the Navy, the U.S. Navy, apologies there, guys, liked the upgraded version. However, they didn't need it. They said, look, we've already got the F-9F, and we have the F-8. We just don't have a need for another fighter, bomber, or attack craft. That's really what they were targeting originally. It was more of an attack craft. But the Navy said a short time later, what we could use is a new fleet defense interceptor. And they outlined some requirements. And McDonald had already some pretty decent experience with the 101 Voodoo for the Air Force, making an interceptor. And so very quickly they had something that the Navy was interested in. And in 1955, the Navy ordered essentially seven aircraft XF-4s. It was a mix of prototypes and kind of pre-production models, but they ordered them. And so McDonald got to work. They did kind of start in some ways with the 101 as well as, like I said, the F-3 Demon. But what came out was its own aircraft for sure. And this was ready to go in May of 1958 and took its first turn in the air on the 27th. Performed quite well, and it wasn't long before the Navy had accepted it, and the following year it began essentially trials and evaluations for carrier operations. And then in 1960 it officially entered into U.S. Navy service, known as the F-4 Phantom II. There was an original Phantom that McDonald had made prior for World War II. So what do we have here? One key reason that the Navy really was all about the design was it was a two-seater. They wanted an interceptor with a powerful radar and other weapons systems, so they needed a back-seater to manage all the complicated electronics. This is kind of that period where electronics were getting sophisticated but also not automated. It required a lot of hands-on activity, and it was really too much for a pilot to keep track of while, flying the plane. So they wanted a two-seater, and that was what McDonald had given them. Like the 101, it had two jet engines. This was something that the higher-ups in McDonald really were a fan of. They felt it gave redundancy and dependability. There's a big back and forth between multi-engine and single engine. It's a big bird. It's 63 feet long. Quite big for a carrier aircraft. It has a wingspan of over 38 feet. And it has a total of 9 hard points on the belly for ordnance and fuel tanks. And it had a plethora of weapons on it. But most commonly, you would find Sparrow missiles, which actually sit in these neat little recessed compartments under the belly, kind of semi-recessed, the Sparrows did. It carried 4 of those. It could also carry 4 Sidewinders, or 6 Mavericks. It also could carry nuclear weapons, rockets, bombs, everything. It was kind of one of the early, truly configurable fighters. Before this, a lot of planes, the ordnance was pretty specific. I mean, there was a couple of options, but this was one of the first in America where you had so many options. And of course, over time, they would upgrade it to take even more. It had that powerful radar the Navy wanted for an interceptor. And it was fast. It could get up to Mach 2.2, maybe even a little faster. So it was up there with amongst the fastest jets of its day. It also had a very impressive ceiling for that day of 60,000 feet. But all that power and this size and all the ordnance had to come at a cost. And that was maneuverability and agility. This was a bit of a hulking, lumbering plane. And it basically flew thanks to brute force. And at the time when it was going into service, the military thought engagements would be fought out past visual range using missiles. So it was not initially given a cannon, something that would very quickly become a detriment when Vietnam kicked off. And also its lack of maneuverability would come to bite it in the ass when it would go up against Russia's new MiG-21. Much smaller and more agile plane. Not as fast, but more agile. So everything comes at a price. So originally made for the Navy, okay? Right as this was going in the Navy service, a couple of things happened. One, the incoming Kennedy administration, with McNamara at the head, really was pushing for a one-fighter-fits-all approach. He wanted the Navy, Air Force, and Marines to adopt one single plane. Also, he wanted them to unify with one naming system, one naming convention. So in 1962, this was done. Names were unified, to some extent anyway. And the Air Force borrowed 2 F-4s from the Navy for test and evaluation. This was called Project High Speed. And in the Navy, it was the F-4. And the Air Force initially called the Phantom the F-110A Spectre. So Spectre, Phantom, get it? And they would try it out and see if it met their needs. And during the trials, it would go up against their cutting-edge interceptor, the F-106 Delta Dart, which I've done a video on, which honestly had just gone into full service a year or two before that. Probably despite itself, the Air Force was suitably impressed with the Navy's Phantom. On September 18th of 1962, the Unified Naming Convention went into effect. The current Navy F-4 was the F-4B. The A had been kind of the earliest production planes, only about 4 dozen, and they never really saw combat. They ended up kind of being used as trainers and guard planes. So the B was the Navy version, and they accepted it, so the Air Force version was named the F-4C. And the F-4C was geared more towards the fighter-bomber role, whereas the Navy version was more of a interceptor air-to-air. The 4C first flew in May of 1963 and would go into production. Also in 1962, the Marine Corps, USMC, would adopt the F-4B, like the Navy, meaning that 3 branches were now using the same fighter. And it was kind of, like I said, all by mistake, not mistake, but all by accident, you know, just kind of in those coincidences. Part of it was that McDonnell had designed this to be a modular plane, so it was pretty easy to reconfigure to suit a user's particular needs. The Navy version first went into service in 1961 and was first on carriers in 1962. By 1964, both the Navy and the Air Force had their versions deployed in theater in Southeast Asia, and they began operations over Vietnam. And in 1965, the Marines joined them, stationing F-4s at Da Nang. And of course, there's a bunch of first downing of a MiG-17, first F-4 being downed by SAM, first MiG-21, you get the drill. Throughout those years, the F-4 would take over more and more from other aircraft, like the F-100 Super Sabre, or F-105 Voodoo. But of course, since it was in hard combat, deficiencies were observed, and that lack of a gun was one of the biggest. Turns out, this notion that the military tacticians had at the end of the second generation of jet fighters and moving into the third, that engagements would happen beyond visual range with missiles, really wasn't all that accurate. For one thing, the rules of engagement in Vietnam pretty much forced American pilots to wait till they had visual confirmation that their target was an enemy before they could fire, which meant MiGs were allowed to close in close. And also, the missiles of the day and time, pretty much all the types, heat-seeking or radar, weren't that reliable. In fact, most pilots had to fire a minimum of 2 missiles to even have a chance at a kill. And of course, a plane like this, even one that could carry a large number, would run out very quickly, having to double down like that. So a cannon was really necessary for being assured. So, the F-4D was the first to offer an external gun pod, as it was called. It was a M61 20mm cannon. And then the F-4E was the first to have an internal cannon. Another important variant was the F-4J of the Navy and Marines, which appeared around 1966, and that's what this model is here. It was more of an air superiority fighter, more of a even dedicated, so air-to-air combat version. It had improved radar, improved weapon guidance, and it was the world's first look-down, shoot-down capable airplane. Which before that was not possible. It also had some other tweaks like larger landing gear, slightly redesigned flaps, and of course tweaking to the engines and controls, the usual stuff you'd expect. By 1970, the Phantom had taken over the bombing role of the F-105 Thunder Chief. Also, the reconnaissance version, the RF-4C, operated by the Air Force, had taken over from many other reconnaissance planes that had come before it. So this was really becoming a ubiquitous American jet in various versions and guises, but it was around. And it would reach peak numbers in Vietnam, with the most F-4 stationed there in 1972. Also that same year, the first National Guard units would receive some F-4s. But this plane was far from done with military service. In fact, it was still in production. McDonnell, now McDonnell Douglas after a merger, would keep making these in America through at least 1979. And these would not only be used by American branches of the military, but also many foreign branches, including Germany and Italy and Britain, and maiden license in Japan by Mitsubishi, who would continue to assemble them at least into the 80s. The U.S. Navy would be the first to start to really phase this out in favor of the F-14 Tomcat, and they would have most all of their F-4s retired by 1987. Next would be the Marine Corps, who would hang on to theirs until after the Gulf War, and they would retire theirs in 1992. But they had already started replacing them with FA-18 Hornets as early as the 1980s. The Air Force, on the other hand, would hang on to them longer than anyone. They would use these in the Gulf War. They would use the F-4G Wild Weasel. They would also use the RF-4C reconnaissance version in that war. And they actually would not retire theirs until 1996. Even then, they would keep about 300 around as drones, unmanned drones, for target testing and other testing until about 2016. And what's funny, the Air Force ended up being by far the largest user of the Phantom, even though it was not initially their plane. They would acquire nearly 2,900. So 2,900 of the nearly 5,200 made, so more than half. The U.S. Navy would acquire about 1,300. And like I said, this would just become a very iconic airplane. This version here is an F-4J of the Navy, circa, I think, 1975. The Air Force version has the very famous camo pattern, which was seen over Vietnam during the war. And the rest is history. And like I said, there's a lot more that could be said, but I think that's a decent synopsis. As far as the Hobbymaster model, this is a new one that just came out in March of 2019. They've had the tooling for this for a number of years. I think they at least go back to 2014, so the F-4 is one of their oldest models. And this is mostly like an earlier version, but they did make a few updates and changes to this. For example, the landing gear is now more or less a single piece that plugs in versus the earlier versions, which had, they'd have a wheel, then a door, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of nice to have a one piece instead of two or three. I also think they've tinkered with the ordnance and the way they peg into the wings. It seems like they go in easier, but also stay in a little better now. And the cockpits seem to be tighter. So I think they've taken the opportunity to slightly tweak the design. It does have the dual canopies with both pilots. The rear canopy does hinge open. The front, you just remove and put in the open one in its place, if you'd like to display with the canopies open. Kind of neat. It's amazing how cramped that rear compartment for the radar weapons officer is. It's really amazing how big of an airplane this is. For its day and time, and the fact that it was meant to operate off of carriers, it really was a chunk. One of its nicknames was the Louisville Slugger. It was just a big brute force plane, which sometimes was to its advantage and sometimes to its detriment. I've done a video on the MiG-21. If you look at it and then kind of compare this in your head, they were very different philosophies. The MiG-21 only carried 4 missiles, or 2 missiles and 2 tanks, whereas this has 2 drop tanks on it, and still this particular setup here has 10 missiles. But it isn't as maneuverable. And of course it costs a lot more to make. But regardless of possible shortcomings, the F-4 was in American service for a very long time, and was in foreign service really up until very recently. In fact, some are in limited service to this very day, because it is still a valid jet fighter, even by modern standards. So yeah, the F-4. I mean, this really replaced pretty much everything in the Century series. It's kind of funny, all those planes, and this replaced it for the most part. The model itself is nothing earth-shattering. There's tons of Phantom models, but this is a good one, and I do like that it has a lot of the ordnance and the cockpits and everything. So it is well done, and they make several paint schemes and variations. They even do a copy of the F-110A Spectre, if you want a your early Air Force look-alike. They do the F-4G Wild Weasel, if you want a Desert Storm Gulf War version. So they even do the Japanese version, and I think they even have a German Air Force version, and I know they have a British Air Force version. So you can pretty much pick your Phantom. I just like U.S. Navy, so, and I like that this was a new tool, a little bit better landing gear. Alrighty folks, I think that's enough for this video. If you have any questions or comments, do please post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe, and maybe check out some of the other videos. Why not? This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.